fifth module for assessment and reading instruction. Today we're going to be looking at vocabulary assessment. I want to take a minute and point out to you that there was actually an activity that you needed to conduct before where you took a couple of questions on a practice reading test for the SAT. And we're kind of directed to look at that and its connection to reading comprehension. If you didn't do that, I'm going to ask you to stop the video right now and do that before you do the video for this class. All right. So today's focus, we're going to explore the complexities of word knowledge and vocabulary acquisition, kind of look at why this is so difficult for us to both teach and assess. We're going to look at some of the frameworks that drive the types of vocabulary assessments. And then we're going to use our knowledge to develop an assessment that is appropriate given what we know about word knowledge. That's actually going to be your homework, your written part of the class. Okay. This is the anchor standard for language that has to do with vocabulary acquisition and use. And you can see the Common Core really kind of reoriented us to vocabulary acquisition. You know, when I was an early teacher in the 90s, I would say the vocabulary was considered a lower level skill, and there was really an emphasis, a kind of prejudice against direct instruction. There was this idea that if we gave students rich texts, they would just naturally acquire the vocabulary, and while that is true for many students, what the Common Core state standards have really oriented us back to is this idea that there's a lot of research that indicates that vocabulary, explicit instruction, direct instruction of vocabulary is in fact effective, and can in fact help students with their reading comprehension. I also wanted to direct your attention to, if you recall, the National Reading Panel. We read a teacher's guide based on that panel, and there was 5 pillars of reading that were identified, and these were phonemic awareness, phonics, fluency, vocabulary, and comprehension. Vocabulary and comprehension have been found to be somewhat different than the other 2. Because the other three are constrained skills, means that once you master it, the skill is the same even if the word gets longer or the passage gets more complex. However, vocabulary and reading comprehension are unconstrained. The boxes, they're not as boxed in. They're multidimensional. We're going to talk about some of these terms later. They're incremental, they're context dependent, and all of that makes them a far more difficult skill to measure, and it probably is because there's many sub-skills that are working in both of those pillars. Okay, so we're in this paradox, okay, because we know that vocabulary clearly is tied to comprehension. In 2000, David Pearson reports out a meta-study where they looked at correlations between vocabulary and reading comprehension, and that was a positive correlation, significantly, statistically significant, of between 0.6 and 0.8. This was a meta-study, so this looked at dozens and dozens of studies that had been done. But the thing is, while we know that vocabulary is tied to comprehension, we also, another study that he talked about was a study that did look at, yes, explicit instruction does help students achieve greater gains than sort of that idea that they would just absorb their vocabulary through reading text in a text-rich environment. But what we don't know is what kind of explicit instruction affects comprehension. So we have this real paradox. We know something is really valuable, and we know that we want to measure those things that are valuable, but we don't know how to measure it. And so we're kind of in this real important place. So what I'm going to show you is Margaret McEwen. She is a vocabulary researcher, and I'm going to have her share a short video where she talks about some of the challenges with vocabulary assessment.
I guess I kind of came accidentally to the area of vocabulary assessment because as a vocabulary researcher, been mostly concerned with designing instruction and coming up with the kinds of language interactions, getting kids to really interact with language and use language, and teaching them sophisticated words. But in order to evaluate how well the instruction went, we needed some measures and found that most measures that are available are pretty poor at figuring out what kids have gotten from especially a rich vocabulary assessment. We didn't want to know whether they just could repeat the definitions for us. We really wanted to know, could they use the words? What did they know about the words? So that forced us to develop a lot of our own assessments. We've done lots of work with teachers, and frequently when I talk to teachers, a big question I get asked is, how do we assess vocabulary? How do we measure? If we're going to do this instruction in vocabulary, how do we know if our kids are getting anything from it? And it's hard. It's hard to come up with good assessments. The practical implication is that vocabulary is an incredibly important area, especially in the era of Common Core standards, where more complex texts have more complex vocabulary. We need to address students' vocabulary needs and know how to do that and what they're getting from it. And so unless we have richer and more sensitive vocabulary measures, we're not going to be able to get that kind of information. So we need better assessments in classrooms and at the broader level, not just ones that individual teachers use, but ones that schools use, so that we have a much more detailed and richer idea of what is it students know about the words that are in their vocabulary, or the words that they're being exposed to in texts and in classes, because only then will teachers know how to address those needs. So our aim is to expand and reimagine the nature of vocabulary assessment, and our overall goal is to develop a set of recommendations for teachers and for researchers about productive ways to measure vocabulary knowledge and growth. And our perspective is that in order to be meaningful, vocabulary assessments need to capture what learners can do with the words that they know. So assessment tasks should reflect how we use vocabulary. So typically, when we're reading a text, for example, we don't have to recall the meaning of every single word we're reading. What we have to do is to access some associations and how they relate to other words in the context, and integrate words in order to come up with the meaning of a text. So that's the kind of direction that we think is productive and meaningful in assessment. So what we aim to do is to bring together scholars across the community. So we really have three distinct groups. We have education researchers who've worked on vocabulary interventions, typically instruction in classrooms with teachers. We have assessment people who've worked on some large-scale assessments like NAEP, like the SAT. And we have linguists, psycholinguists, computational linguists, who have a much broader view of language and use and see what they have to say about how we might think about and examine vocabulary. The kind of knowledge that needs to be assessed is not definitional. It is what can students do with the words that they know, and how useful are those words that they're supposedly learning or that they supposedly know? How do they use them? I think that's what I'd want people to be thinking about.
Okay. So as you can tell, this is really a very difficult and complex idea. And so what I thought we could do is I thought we could sort of dig in a little bit on what we know about vocabulary and what are some of the assessment practices that are very common. Okay, so in 1965, the Dale stages of vocabulary acquisition was developed. And this really said that there are 4 distinct stages to vocabulary acquisition. First one being never having heard or seen the word. Second one is knowing that there is a word but not knowing its meaning or anything about it. Third one would be having context-bound and vague knowledge of the word. And then the final one would be you know the word well and you can remember it. So those were Dale stages of vocabulary acquisition. Beck, McKeown, and Omenson in 1987, and that became kind of a prevailing thought. They really reconsidered this idea of stages and moved it to this continuum. Continuums is more about degrees. It is sort of more of a sliding scale, if you will. It's a little bit messier. And in their continuum, they have this idea that on the continuum would be no knowledge, general understanding, narrow but context-based understanding. You have knowledge of the word, but you don't know its appropriate use. And then the next one would be decontextualized knowledge of the word. You can use it if you encounter in a new context. You understand it. So that's really much stronger ideas, especially in the end, the final, what they would consider fully acquiring the word knowledge that's a little bit more complex. I think part of the reason why this is such a tricky conversation really has to do with the stat that I have up here. So there are 9,000 words that vocabulary experts have defined as critical words for elementary students to know. Of those 9,000 words, 70% of those words would be what we would call polysemous, meaning that they have more than one word, more than one meaning, and that the meaning is content specific. So you think of the word operation, right? Operation surgery, operation plan. And so this becomes very difficult for us to think about. So that goes back to that idea of it is an unconstrained skill. All right. Something to keep in mind is that words are linguistically complex. They're not simple units. So first thing is, knowing a word is not an all or nothing thing. We can know a word incrementally. There are nuances and collocations of words matter. So the meaning of a word is multidimensional. For instance, we use the word storm front, but we don't use the word storm back. And so that becomes kind of, gives a dimensional aspect to word knowledge. Polysemic words have multiple meanings. So the word run has 20 meanings. The word run, a simple 3-letter word that a student might learn in kindergarten, or might read in kindergarten, has 20 meanings. Interrelatedness means that knowledge of a word entails deriving associations with related words or meanings, or drawing together background knowledge. And so, if we hear the word the dog barked, to be able to understand dog barking, a learner might use their knowledge of the noise that they've heard dogs make. They may not have read the word bark before, they may not even have heard the word bark before, but their background knowledge allows them to come to some understanding. Heterogeneity, I hope that's how I say it. It means that a word's meaning differs depending on its function and structure. So there's some syntactic things that you have to consider. So let me give you 2 sentences to give you an example. If I said, I spilled the coffee, go get the broom, what you're going to assume coffee means are maybe coffee grounds or the coffee beans, right? Coffee in its solid state. However, I've changed that sentence and I say, I spilled the coffee, go get the mop. What that means is coffee at that point means the liquid version of it, the brewed version of it. And so, it's very complex. So words are a lot more complex than I think we sort of generally consider. All right. So a study in 2000 by the National Reading Project demonstrated that students learn vocabulary best when they use it in meaningful and authentic contexts. We also know, the Common Core talks about words as in tiers. Tier 1 vocabulary words are frequently used. They're sight words, they're not taught. They're not the focus of direct vocabulary instruction. Tier 2 words are frequently used across contexts and levels. So, and then Tier 3 words are content-specific words, like osmosis for science, congruence for math. So what we want to think about then is Tier 2 words. We want to think about, well, actually, congruence, can't you see? That could be a Tier 2 word in some contexts, and it could be a Tier 3 word in other contexts. But we know that we get the best bang for our buck as vocabulary teachers when we focus in on those Tier 2 words, because that's where the student is going to see, is going to be exposed to them across the context. Okay, so what are some of the assessments that we see out there already for teachers in classrooms trying to figure out what's going on with their students with vocabulary attainment and word knowledge? Oh shoot, I don't know why this keeps doing this, but let me go ahead and share with you a little video. This teacher is going to give what's called the Peabody Picture Vocabulary Test.
Have you had a good morning so far? Good. Did you eat your breakfast?
Yes.
Okay, good. Alright, so today I am going to show you some pictures and ask you to point to some things for me. Okay? It's just a little test, a little bit of pictures we gotta look at. First off, Ella, how old are you, Ella?
I am 6.
You're 6 years old. When is your birthday?
January the 10th.
January 10th. So you just turned 6, huh? Great. So you were born in what year? Do you know? That's okay. Alrighty. Let's make sure this is good. Scooch over just a little bit. There you go. Scoot back just a little bit. I don't want to hit you with it. Perfect. Alright, we're going to do a couple practice, okay? Look at the pictures on this page. Put your finger on the baby. Very good. Put your finger on car. Very good.
Okay, I'm going to stop it there. I don't think you need to see the whole assessment being given. But the Peabody Picture Vocabulary Test is an early screening test. It offers a quick estimate of a student's receptive vocabulary. This is really good, especially when we're thinking about students that are at risk. We know that there is a lot of discrepancy, socioeconomic discrepancies between just the exposure that students have, how verbally rich their environment is, and this allows us to identify those students that are at risk from the very beginning. So the Peabody Picture Vocabulary Test is one type of assessment of vocabulary. Oh, I don't know why you're not getting my picture. The next one is the Iowa Test of Basic Skills, and many of us are familiar with this. We probably took this in elementary schools ourselves. This was a typical paper and pencil test, and a common it has a vocabulary test separate from its reading test. It's a subtest of its own. And so in this one, you'll see something like this: the hostile neighbor. And then the students are to figure out what is the best replacement for hostile. This is different than you probably noticed in the SAT. The vocabulary was part of the reading instruction, or the reading test, and so the reading comprehension score is given, and then there's a sub-score for vocabulary. Iowa Test of Basic Skills actually has its own vocabulary. So when we are thinking about frameworks for designing assessments, there really are some frameworks to consider, and there are some things that have fallen out of favor. Discrete versus embedded is a really, really important idea. Discrete is this idea that words are tested in isolation. You can see how that has really kind of an outdated model. Things like the NAEP scores, that assumes vocabulary items are interspersed with comprehension items, and it's viewed as part of the comprehension construct. even if a subscore is given. So discrete versus embedded, you really can see how we're moving away from this idea of discrete. Selective versus comprehensive asks the questions of whether or not, how large of a word set to focus in on. Are we being very selective? Are we talking about comprehensive word knowledge? And then there's context independent versus context dependent. Context independent, again, is probably fallen out of favor where, it's definitional. Context dependent is where, you want to know, can the student encounter a word in different contexts and be able to negotiate the meaning of that word. Okay, so some types of classroom vocabulary. Vocabulary knowledge rating skills are really good formative assessments. In these, the students are given words that maybe they're going to encounter in an upcoming reading assignment, and they are given a scale for themselves. 1, I've never even seen this word. 2, yeah, I know this word really well, and they're kind of able to assess where they are before. It's about helping them to grow awareness of vocabulary, this metacognition piece to it. There is another type of test, which is the vocabulary, oh gosh, this is terrible, the VRT. And I'll get you what that means in a second here, and I'm horrible. Let's see here. The VRT is the vocabulary recognition task. And the vocabulary recognition task offers a pre-test where students are given a list, and they're asked to basically identify. So this is given usually in a content area classroom. So let's say in this example, the students were given a science reading about bugs. And so what happens is in their pre-list, they're asked to check off every word that they know is an insect, or maybe every word that you know that is associated with the forest ecosystem, whatever it might be. And so they do that, and then they complete the reading, and then they go in and they categorize. The post-test is for them to be able to categorize based on something related to the reading, the text that they read. So that is a vocabulary recognition task, because I remembered the word so well. The next one would be what we call a vocabulary magazine, assessment magazine. This is related to literacy very closely. In this, the students would read a passage that has the targeted vocabulary. They respond to the passage, or they respond to an open-ended question. In this one, it says, what do you think this magazine will be about? It's, trying to engage them in literacy, get them thinking verbally, verbal reasoning. And then the third thing is that they get a task that involves drawing and then writing about the targeted vocabulary from the passage. So this passage would have been about roots, so they were asked to talk about 2 types of roots and then draw those and write a sentence. So it's a nice, you can see it as kind of like multisensory, so it's kind of a different approach to vocabulary. Okay, so this is, admittedly a little bit more of an underdeveloped module, certainly, than the previous ones, and I think it's because of just this underdeveloped nature of our understanding of how to meaningfully assess word knowledge. To be able to extend this lesson a little bit and to get you thinking a little bit on your own on this, what I have done is on Leo, I have posted 3 articles about vocabulary instruction and assessment. There are 3 of them. These 3 are, just to give you a sense of what the articles are. The first article, I don't know if it's first, second, and third, but one article is about 9 things every teacher should know about words and vocabulary. Kind of it's from a Journal of Adult and Adolescent Literacy. Kind of a nice overview about sort of the mindsets and frameworks for vocabulary instruction. The other one is words everywhere, which ones do we teach? And it looks at this idea of tiering vocabulary. How do we know where to focus in on given all the options that are out there? And then the last one looks at this idea of being able to look at Latin and Greek connections and building vocabulary through study of those connections. So what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to read one of those 3 articles for your assignment. Then on Leo, I have, let me pull this up for you. On Leo, I have a vocabulary assessment reflection where after you've read your article, what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to design an assessment or part of an assessment that you think would be appropriate for classroom measure of word knowledge. So clearly this is going to look very differently if you are, if your field placement is in a high school setting versus in a preschool setting. I am fine with you finding models online. There are some really creative teachers out there. The only thing I would ask that you do is that you modify it so that it is specific. So let's say you find a really good assessment or a vocabulary activity that you would then turn and create an assessment off of. That would be fine, but modify it for your specific situations. So maybe you have an upcoming unit on the solar system. Use it to identify vocabulary words from a text that they're going to be reading, something like that. I don't want you to copy and paste something from Pinterest. I do want you to kind of personalize this, and use it to develop your own skills. When you are done, I want you to write a 1-page reflection or explanation of the assessment that you created or that you modified, and explain why you think it's effective. Given what you learned in this mini lesson, I'll call it a mini lesson because I don't think I was quite as full of knowledge as some others. And then I want you to consider what we know about the need for assessments. Things like we know that students need to draw associations, they need to build context, they need to integrate words. That is what is good vocabulary assessment, and how is what you just did an example of good vocabulary assessment. So if you can work on that, upload that to Leo by Sunday and continue working on your field experience. Other than that, hope that you guys have a good week, and I'll be back for our 6th module.